on to the last speaker for the day, which is me. My name is Eger, by the way, from the University of New South Wales. Can you go to, great. So we all know the old saying, if a tree falls in a forest and no one's around to hear it, does it make a sound? Well, for much of Western history, those fallen trees haven't really made a sound, or if it did, it was heard and cared by for very few people. But now as times are changing, these fallen trees are starting to make a noise, and people are indeed caring about it and working to restore these sorts of ecosystems. So now let me ask you, what if that fallen tree was underwater? And with kelp forests, as we got to see in the plenary speech early this morning, are just that. Vast marine forests that support teeming marine ecosystems. And so I'm going to introduce you to a kelp forest in California. Here we have Macrocystis, which is really a redwood among the kelp plants. And within these waters, we have sea otters waving alow, abalone, a marine snail, cling to wave-swept rocks, fish rustle through the canopy as lobsters scuttle around, and sea stars and hundreds of other marine species go about their daily business. And for us humans, it gets even better. Kelps draw down carbon from the atmosphere, they exude oxygen, they remove excess nutrients from the water column, and they draw down visitors to their emerald depths. And these ecosystems cover over a third of our global coastlines and are immensely important to marine systems around the world. Now, unfortunately, these kelp forests are also facing global declines, and these Macrocystis forests and others like them are disappearing in our temperate seas. So as sea temperatures rise, invasive species like sea urchins devour entire forests, sedimentation and pollution choke out plants. We're losing these really important ecosystems and all the services that they provide. In areas like Tasmania, Northern California, Southeastern Japan, we're seeing near total losses of these kelp forests, right? We're getting 95 to 98% declines in living memory, sometimes in the span of just 10 to 15 years. And so with these declines, we're starting to see the closure of multi-million-dollar fisheries such as abalone and lobster, the loss of that carbon capture, the loss of the nutrient cycling, and just frankly, the loss of that sense of place for people who find comfort beneath the waves. Now, people have been working to restore kelp forests, and we can actually go back quite some time to 1716, when a monk living in northern Japan on the island of Hokkaido instructed villagers to start casting stones into the ocean next to existing kelp forests so that the plants could settle onto this new substrate in an effort to kind of mitigate the damage that was being done by harvesting. And since those early days, kelp forest restoration has spread, albeit slowly, around the globe. So now we have restoration efforts in Europe, the Mediterranean, Asia continuing, Australasia, North and South America. And there's a few different approaches to restore a kelp forest. There's not just one way of going about it. You can create an artificial reef like St. Tiedan did in 1716 for kelp spores to settle and to grow. You can put out the microscopic form of kelp forests, hope they attach and then grow into forests. You can take juvenile or adult plants, adhere them to the substrate, and then hope that then grows into a new forest. Or you can work to control grazers like the sea urchin that I was talking about before, other herbivorous fish that would otherwise devour the entire forest. And what I'm hoping to get across here is that there's really a lot of ways to go about restoring kelp forests, right? There's not just one single methodology that you can apply, and each of these general methodologies then has different approaches and techniques within that. So it's quite a potentially complicated process with a lot to consider. And we also have a lot of different groups involved in kelp forest restoration. So if you're industry, you might be interested in restoration from a perspective of offsetting, where you're required to restore a forest that was damaged due to a development project. If you're an academic, you might be interested in kelp forest restoration from a purely scientific point of view and a research output. Or if you're an NGO or local governing group, you might be looking to restore kelp forests just to bring back that set of ecosystem or the services that they're providing for your local community. And so there's a lot of differing motivations for why you might be interested in restoring a kelp forest, but ultimately people are kind of driving towards this one goal with a bit of a common ground. And kind of interesting within kelps is there's a whole lot of diversity for what you would consider a kelp. And the order that you would most classically considered kelp, there's 13 genera, and the other order, Fucalis, that you might broaden to consider kelp, there's 41. So across these two orders, you have a whole range of morphologies, life history requirements, reproduction strategies, and things that you might need to consider as you go about restoration. So there's just quite a bit of knowledge that's needed to restore a kelp forest. And right now it's really being generated locally and not shared across these different regions. So people in Norway might not be communicating with people in Japan, partly due to a language barrier, but there's also problems even within countries where different sectors aren't really talking to each other. And all the lessons learned from these emerging kelp forest restoration projects aren't being shared, and people aren't driving the field forward in kind of a uniform step. And then a second problem that we come up to as we're starting to talk about is this lack of an agreed upon data collection standard. So people are recording information about their emergent kelp forest projects in totally different ways. They're collecting different variables, they're using different units, and then this makes it really hard to generate a comprehensive understanding of what the field of kelp forest restoration looks like. It also makes it really difficult to start to perform analyses where you might want to get at what makes certain projects more successful than others. And kelp forests, compared to other systems, terrestrial and marine, are really an emergent system for restoration. So with this, we have a bit of an opportunity in that these approaches aren't currently entrenched, right? There isn't a set way of doing things. We have people really interested in restoring kelp forests, and they're getting really excited about it. And so now we potentially have the opportunity to work together and start to kind of collaborate and coordinate. So we're doing it in a really unified fashion and bringing together all these different pieces of information, but also working together to address the big gaps in the field. And so what we're proposing to work on to start to address these sorts of issues is the Kelp Forest Alliance. And what this is a group of persons or organizations working in kelp forest restoration or conservation who are interested in the protection and restoration of these ecosystems. And we're looking to produce and facilitate knowledge exchange for how to restore kelp forests and why that might be important, and also just raise the advocacy and profile of kelp forest restoration. As Adrian was talking about this morning, kelp forests are often kind of a forgotten marine ecosystem that actually occupy quite a bit of the world's coastline, but aren't talked about or appreciated. Though perhaps with my octopus teacher, that's starting to change. I should add. And so this is really open to anyone who's interested in this. It's just a very open and collaborative group. We aren't looking to monopolize kelp forest restoration, but to get everyone together into a network, basically, to start to work towards these sorts of things. And so we're at the very early stages so far. So I'll just take you through some of the things that we've been working on and some of the things that we'd like to accomplish going into the future to date. So the first step was building a project database where we tried to collect data on every kelp forest restoration project that has ever happened. That didn't quite happen with some language barriers in Japanese and Korean that just provided a little bit too difficult to overcome. But we've kind of put in our best effort at collecting information on as many restoration projects we could. And this includes projects in English, Japanese, Korean, Spanish, and Norwegian. And then with this, we've kind of started to coincidentally start that data standard that I was talking about what information you would want to collect for recording information about your kelp forest project. And we've also been able to run a bit of a quantitative analysis on the existing information to start to look at what methods might be best for going about doing kelp forest restoration. And then building on the quantitative side of things, we've also worked on the qualitative side of things. So we hosted 4 different workshops with 33 kelp restoration experts from around the world in Australasia, North America, South America, Europe, as well as received additional input from our Korean and Japanese colleagues on what lessons they've learned from doing their kelp restoration projects, and started to produce a best available state of the field for how you should go about doing kelp forest restoration. And so what we're working on is translating these workshops into about a 60-page document, along with 12 case studies with about 50 authors to date on how you would do kelp forest restoration. So the idea is, if you're interested in doing this project, you don't really have any idea what a kelp forest is, barely, you can come to this document, you can have a look, you can get an idea of why restoration might be important, what sorts of things you need to consider when you're getting started with the restoration project. And then most specifically, you can start to look at the different methodologies that were available and start to see where people have gone wrong and where people have gone right in applying these methodologies. And similarly with this, we can also start to hopefully encourage people to follow these set upon standards for restoration. This information together. And it will be online, freely available, and it's really meant to be this best knowledge to date, right? It's not meant to be the be-all, end-all, but it will be updated as more information comes in that's hopefully generated by the network itself. And so as data gaps are filled or techniques are improved upon, the guidebook itself can be updated as we go. So one of the really fun parts of building the database is because not a lot of the information was published in scientific reports, is I got to just calling and emailing a whole lot of people all around the world who are working in kelp forest restoration and kind of incidentally developed this very long contact list of people who are doing it. So what we'd like to do with this is start to use this as the basis for the network. As I said, we've got about 175 people on the list so far, with representation from 16 different countries and totally different sectors. We've got the person who's restoring kelp in their free time in their backyard, all the way up to U.S. Army Corps of Engineers and their multi-million-dollar projects. And the idea is that we can then have these people together on a centralized platform and start to encourage discussions about how to do kelp forest restorations. Identify who might be an expert in a certain field, and then as they're part of the network, you have an opportunity to go and connect with them and learn what they've learned, and then vice versa. And hopefully you can also use this to generate collaboration in the field and start to set research directives. So we will get together and have an online conference at this point on what the current state is and where the data gaps are. We can agree to those collectively and start to agree on how to collaborate to address those issues. So say you want to run a project in Sydney, you can also connect with someone in Canada, someone in Chile, and someone in Norway to coincidentally run that project and generate information to them. And lastly, we have the website, because everybody needs a website. We're just in the final processes of getting like the beta version of this out, so you can try to go to the web address. It may or may not work at this point, but within the next 1 or 2 days, hopefully we'll have a version for you all to look at and interact with. And the idea of the website is to host the guidebook, host the database, and as I said, be a platform for the network itself where users can then log in and then communicate with each other on this kelp forest restoration. And with that, we'd also like to have a standardized data entry portal. So going back to that format that I was talking about, you can then go to the website, you can enter data on your new restoration project, and then that information is just added to the existing database. So somebody else doesn't have to come along in 10 years and then recompile every kelp project that exists. There's just this living database that's updated as it goes. And generally, it's going to then also kind of act as a home, hopefully, to provide information about kelp forests and why they're important. So if you just Googled kelp forests, then maybe one day this would come up and it would have information about fisheries provided by kelp forests or other reasons that you might be interested in kelp forest restoration. And with this, I'm highlighting a few different restoration success stories around the world. We're again just hoping to raise the profile of these underwater ecosystems and promote further restoration efforts, either through methodological advances or just through increased awareness, or perhaps lobbying at some point for restoration efforts. So this is all very much an emergent effort. We're kind of at the Microsoft in the garage version. We're running on a very small budget. Like that. So we're learning as we go, and if you're interested in talking about it, please come chat. My email is up here, or we'll be around for the rest of the conference. And I realize I have no one to moderate my time except myself, but I think I did all right. So if anyone has any questions, I'd be happy to take them. And thanks for listening.
Thanks, Aaron. I just wondered, because the Mangrove crowd has been pretty active in making a similar kind of, the Global Mangrove Alliance, and they're also working on some restoration products, which is sort of interesting. But they have that. But they're developing a standardized restoration set of questions for a standardized data entry as well. And I just wondered whether there's some overlap and whether it could be like more similar, like the sort of platform could be similar, and so that basically people could pull data in a similar format for both ecosystems relatively easily? Because it's actually TNC who's pretty fundamental in that mangrove one as well.
Yep. Yeah. Yeah. So we are talking with the Global Mangrove Alliance folks. I actually want to mention them at some point in the presentation, and giving input on their standards for restoration, and then also providing what we're working on. And then we're also developing at this point kind of a concept piece that we need to figure out the logistics and like getting it down, but more of a marine ecosystem restoration monitoring standard, because really you're considering a lot of the same things. And there may be parts of that that could be turned on and off depending on what system you're working on. But at this point, there's no one who has total ownership of that. So we've just kind of like worked in parallel doing the kelp and doing the mangroves, and then talking about how we could do this multi-ecosystem one with oyster reefs or seagrass or salt marsh as well. But it just requires a bit to take that step. And I do know there's some opportunities with the UN Decade for Restoration. So they have a monitoring task force, but their meetings are always at 1 a.m. Sydney time, and I very rarely get to tune in. Yeah. Yeah.
Just on networks, I just wanted to get your thoughts on, a lot of networks around, people can get kind of network fatigue, for one of the better term. Like, have you thought about how to engage people, after the inception of the network, to keep people involved so they don't just sign up and make money?
Yep. So the idea, and again, pending funding and success and everything working out exactly as you plan it, would be have kind of a yearly meeting to debrief on this sort of thing. On the fatigue side of things, kelp is nice because there just aren't that many networks that exist around kelp. I mean, there are a few like in Northern California, or there's an ecology one that's more science focused, but most people that I've talked about have been like, yes, this is exactly the conversation I want to have. I've just never known about how to have it. So I guess they haven't been inundated with these sorts of networks or things right now. So I guess in this space, it's still a bit fresh for a lot of these sort of people.
I've got a question about, in the United States at the moment, there's a number of people that are trying kelp farming. Have they hooked into this at all? And I mean, it's meant to be a commercial enterprise.
Yeah.
And different goal, obviously, but potentially.
Yeah, I tend to get an email about kelp farming or blue carbon credits like once every 2 weeks or something from somebody who sees what we're working on. And I think there's some potential to kind of integrate or at least work in lockstep towards these sort of things, but obviously the end goals are quite different. There might be some space for, say, kelp farms to provide materials for restoration as part of like a social good or a corporate responsibility side to their business program. Or, if we've talked about having kelp farms acting as a settlement part if you build your kelp farm over a reef that needs restoring or things like that. So I think there will be opportunities for restoration, but ultimately I've tried to keep it away too much from that space, because I feel that it opens it up to, I guess, greenwashing, where they then talk about farming as restorative. And I guess there are, again, like very narrow concepts in which that could be restorative, but generally it's an extractive process, right? You aren't permanently restoring an area. I think we're out of time, but we can chat because it's lunch if you have a question. Yeah. No one needs to eat, right? They just want to hear about kelp. Yeah, I mean, yeah.
Sorry,
you can leave if you want to.
Yeah, that's right.
Declare your case.
I guess it's more of a comment in a way, but just as a recent recruit to TNC, to the Nature Conservancy, I guess, I'm interested and surprised to see that there are all these restoration manuals in these very different fields, and just wondering, seeing some of the similar issues that are coming up, whether or not, again, like that idea of lessons learned, it doesn't matter. The topic is kind of the same, and I think there are a lot of benefits that could be got from it. And I guess the other thing is the shellfish program has been running for quite a while, and there is a lot of, I guess, that point about network fatigue, but also engagement with aquaculturists and farmers, and there's a lot of specific knowledge that they have for certain parts of the program in terms of their longevity of working with the animals and those ecosystems. So I think that there are times, and stages where they're involved in the networks and proffer a lot of really valuable biological information. But yeah, you're right. The network fatigue thing is something that is a challenge. Yeah, I guess the thing that we've seen happen is that we've got these kind of subgroups, little regional informal discussion groups that keep going, that wax and wane a little bit, depending upon the stage and the challenges that people are finding with their projects. But I guess the network's there to dip into when maybe you need it, but trying to always keep it going in attendance. Yeah, people wear out of it from it. It just
Yeah, if you fail to register the web domain for another year and it just kind of fizzles, right? Yeah, that it just becomes a question of having someone or someones to kind of dedicatedly drive it forward and the funding to continue to make that happen and be that engagement person, which in Kelp is nice. It's a smallish field. Everyone mostly wants to be friends. All right, thanks for joining us for technology. I mean,